Victoria Osteen observed, when we obey God, we're not doing it for God, we're doing it for ourselves, because God takes pleasure when we're happy. When you come to church, when you worship Him, you're not doing it for God, really. You're doing it for yourself. Such a view is absurd and unbiblical. The Bible teaches that our chief aim is to glorify God. However, there are many who seem to agree with Mrs. Osteen that God's chief end is to glorify man and enjoy him forever. American Christianity seems to have become me-centered rather than God-centered. Mark Driscoll said, "It is possible to go to church and hear little about God and much about you. Church has become about us. Did I like the songs that were sung? Do I like the preacher's style? Worship assemblies are planned around the thoughts and concerns of the worshiper rather than the one being worshiped. Too often, worship has become all about me, my desires, my likes, my preferences, what I want, and that is nothing less than idolatry." This has been called cat and dog theology. A dog says, "You pet me, feed me, shelter me, and love me, you must be God." A cat says, "You pet me, feed me, shelter me, and love me, I must be God." Those mistaken attitudes fit many in modern Christianity. An incorrect view of God results in incorrect worship of God. God is viewed by many as a means to an end and not an end in and of himself. Denny Petrillo wrote, "After examining various types of men in this life, Solomon turned his attention to one more type, the worshiper. In this section, he considered man's actions in the house of God and gave sound advice for making sure worship is not vain." In chapter 5 of Ecclesiastes, the language of reflection in chapter 4 changes to the language of instruction. Solomon, for the first time, addresses his readers with the second person, you. Perhaps he is saying, "This is important, pay attention." Our text begins and ends with admonitions concerning a person's attitude toward God. And several other times in Ecclesiastes, Solomon will address the same theme, one's attitude toward God. What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. Our attitude toward God determines our attitude toward everything else. In Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verses 1 through 7, Solomon warns of 3 sins of a specifically religious nature. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. Go near to listen rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools, who do not know that they do wrong. Do not be quick with your mouth. Do not be hasty in your heart to utter anything before God. God is in heaven, and you are on earth, so let your words be few. As a dream comes when there are many cares, so the speech of a fool when there are many words. When you make a vow to God, do not delay in fulfilling it. He has no pleasure in fools. Fulfill your vow. It is better not to vow than to make a vow and not fulfill it. Do not let your mouth lead you into sin, and do not protest to the temple messenger, "My vow was a mistake." Why should God be angry at what you say and destroy the work of your hands? Much dreaming and many words are meaningless. Therefore, stand in awe of God. Solomon first addresses the sin of ignorant and careless worship, verse 1. We stand in need of an altogether greater companionship. The preacher earlier told of a God who gives a life of joy and pleasure. And so the question arises, may this God be approached? Chapter 5 opens with a sobering warning about a person's approach to God. One must approach God with the utmost sobriety and care. Guard your steps is the first instruction. This indicates the forethought and preparation that are necessary before one attempts to enter into God's presence to worship. Solomon speaks of the house of God. In his day, this no doubt would have been thought of as the temple. To the godly Israelite, it was the focal point of reverent devotion and meditation. He loved the temple for the divine glory which was there, in which he desired to dwell forever. Now, not just anything we choose to offer God is acceptable. Ignorance is no excuse for failing to worship God acceptably. The core problem of our failure to deal with God as we ought is too small a grasp of, or even an inaccurate view of who God is. Now, God is merciful and gracious, but He is also above and beyond all that we might imagine in wisdom, power, and righteousness. It is a very dangerous thing to toy with such a God. We must remember, God rules, we do not. God's knowledge is limitless. Ours is tiny by comparison. We should approach God in awe-struck wonder that the eternally righteous God would allow the likes of us to draw near to Him. We should move into the presence of God with silence, a silence that comes from a submissive willingness to listen rather than to talk. We should listen to God's infinite knowledge and wisdom. We are not in a position to teach God anything. It is important to listen to God. Go near to listen. We are to hear what God has to say. And the Hebrew indicates that we hear so as to do. In other words, we listen to what God has to say in anticipation of obeying what He tells us. Approaching God in the right way will keep us from offering the sacrifice of fools. Such is evil, but the fool doesn't realize it because he has been talking instead of listening. Attitude takes priority, even over the act in the worship of God. In Psalm 51, verses 16 and 17, we read, "You do not delight in sacrifice, or I would bring it. You do not take pleasure in burnt offerings. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. O God, you will not despise." The Israelite coming to the temple, bringing sacrifices. It was very important that they listen to the Word of God, that they have the right attitude as they approach God with their sacrifices. There are too many times it is mentioned that the sacrifices are being offered on a regular basis, but the heart of the people was not right before God. Now, the foolish person imagines that he can robotically follow the outward forms of worship God has prescribed and treat God's moral and spiritual will with contempt. It is also foolish to imagine that we can ignore God's instructions on how to worship as long as our intentions are worshipful. We cannot worship God when our will takes precedence over His. And so the key to worship is listening to and obeying God. Next, Solomon has something to say about careless speech, verses 2 and 3 and verse 7. We must watch our words when we come into the presence of God in worship. Mindless babble, which has no depth of heart or thought, will not do. There are 4 cautions that Solomon gives to help one guard his steps as he comes to worship God. He says, think before speaking. Do not be quick with your mouth. Think before acting. Do not be hasty in your heart. Think about your worship in advance. Think about your position in relation to God. We must remember, as Solomon says, that God is in heaven and we are on earth. He is God and we are not. He is almighty. We are not. Before we speak to God, we must reverently consider who we are dealing with. Habakkuk chapter 2 verse 20 says, "But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him." The little children's song from long ago, "Tiptoe, tiptoe in God's house, tiptoe very softly." On the one level, it may have made some children think, well, this place is holy in and of itself. But actually its value was in reminding even little children that when we come together to worship God, it is a serious matter. We need to be reverent as we approach God. Now, it is always good to listen, always good to think before we speak. It is imperative to do so when dealing with God. And Solomon also says here, think more and say less. He says, so let your words be few. What hinders a person from effective and accepted worship is too much talking and not enough listening. Logic dictates that the fool should be quiet, for he needs to learn. His failure to see this is what makes him a fool. In Matthew chapter 12, verses 36 and 37, we find a similar warning on the lips of Jesus. He says, "But I tell you that men will have to give account on the day of judgment for every careless word they have spoken. For by your words you will be acquitted, and by your words you will be condemned." Careless speech demonstrates a failure to fear God, and we must beware that our approach to Him in worship is not casual. Then Solomon addresses the matter of unpaid vows, verses 4 through 7. Another way of serving God that Solomon mentions is the making of vows. A vow was a sort of agreement that proposed to God. Vows in the Old Testament devotions were usually made in the context of public worship. The worshiper made a commitment to do something if God would grant his request. Solomon warns his readers to watch what they say in the presence of God. He then tells them to do what they say. Now, vows, as Solomon mentions here, were voluntary. They were not required. But if one made a vow, he was to keep that vow. As Paul Earnhardt said, human beings are prone to rattling off heedless promises which make us feel better at the moment, but are quickly forgotten. The making of a vow under the Old Covenant was serious business. Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 21 through 23. If you make a vow to the Lord your God, do not be slow to pay it, for the Lord your God will certainly demand it of you, and you will be guilty of sin. But if you refrain from making a vow, you will not be guilty. Whatever your lips utter, you must be sure to do, because you made your vow freely to the Lord your God with your own mouth. Proverbs 20, verse 25, it is a trap for a man to dedicate something rashly and only later to consider his vows. Solomon basically warns his hearers not to play religious games, to make vows and then try to get out of them. Jesus gives a strong warning about oaths in Matthew chapter 23. It seemed that the Jews, at least the Jewish leaders, were very adamant about keeping the vows, but then they started looking for loopholes to get out of them. Often we do that. People's mouths can drag them into sin. If they make a vow, they are unable to keep. In fact, Solomon says, you make this vow, you don't keep it, the temple messenger will come. That might have been a priest, it might have been someone the priest sent, but they apparently come to collect on the vow. And the person says, oh, that vow was a mistake. I shouldn't have made it. Sometimes people make promises to God, and when it comes time to fulfill those promises, they make lame excuses. Solomon says, not keeping the vow will anger God. Michael Eaton observed, a voluntary offering vowed to a temple priest is unfulfilled. The temple priest or his messenger comes to inquire. Oh, it was a mistake is the worshiper's evasion. But God sees, and a careless approach to him may bring his anger upon our words and his judgment upon our works. For some people, God becomes a cosmic bellhop. A vow is made in an effort to manipulate God. I remember, as a young person, a man who was an unfaithful Christian became very seriously ill. He had not been to church in a long time, at least he came on a very irregular basis. And he promised God that if God would just let him get well, he would be faithful. He got well. He did not become faithful. That man was not alone in promising God something. People today make promises to God. If you'll just let me get well, if you'll just help me get a job, if you, on and on it goes. If you'll just do that, I'll serve you faithfully. But when the person recovers from the illness, when they get better from whatever the situation is, they quickly forget their promise. Believers today should note carefully the vows we make to God, especially the vow inherent in our decision to follow Jesus and our confession of faith in him at the time of our baptism. Solomon says of the one making the vow, not keeping it, not good results, but he then speaks about much dreaming, and many words are meaningless. You know, we might say that dreams are out of touch with reality. I have some really strange dreams. The other night, I was in the same place with the president. I don't ever expect that to happen. No matter who the president, I don't ever expect that. But it got in my dream, didn't it? For some reason. But sometimes the many words uttered during a period of worship, Solomon says, can be like dreams. Dreams, as in he has big dreams, can be nothing more than the foolish fantasy of one who is self-deceived. One who speaks many words to God can be deceived. First, we listen to what God says. We do what God says. And that will keep us from saying a whole bunch of things we shouldn't say. People are prone to carry their illusions with them while they worship, and also to talk without thinking. If a vow is made this way, the worshiper is treading on dangerous ground. The remedy is to fear God. Solomon concludes this instruction, therefore stand in awe of God. Other translations say, fear God. God is the one you must fear. Our culture is lacking in reverence for authority. Parents, teachers, coaches, and law officers are no longer approached with respect, much less with fear. There's even a lack of respect for God. But God must not be taken lightly. The foolish use of words and promises is meaningless. What the worshiper should do is fear God. The one who stands in awe of God will not make foolish promises to God, but will think before he speaks. Dave Bland summed up his commentary on this section. The fundamental issue in this passage is one's attitude before God. The worshiper must take responsibility for a moral lifestyle, watch your feet, and exercise restraint in uttering prayers and vows to God. Verse 7 expresses the attitude in a nutshell. Therefore, stand in awe of God, fear God. He is holy other. Solomon's instructions from long ago are still timely. Worship is still a serious matter. We must never play church. There's a song that I sing at least once a year because I sing it at camp. We didn't have camp this year. But last year when we had camp, we had our Starlight Devotional. It was the first camp after the death of my brother, which was 2 years ago this month. And I talked about that. I no doubt talked about one needing to have a relationship with God, about that there was more to life than this life. And at the conclusion of that song, of that talk, we sang the song that I sing each year at camp. You are beautiful beyond description, too marvelous for words, too wonderful for comprehension, like nothing ever seen or heard. Who can grasp your infinite wisdom? Who can fathom the depths of your love? You are beautiful beyond description, majesty enthroned above, and I stand in awe of you. I stand in awe of you. Holy God, to whom all praise is due, I stand